totally a man of nature, and in that he was kind of a
The
wild
Waltons
man.
looked like one of television's happiest families, but the real story behind the cast departures was much more complicated. Richard Thomas left after 5 seasons because he wanted to escape the shadow of John Boy and build a wider career. Michael Learned eventually became dissatisfied with Olivia Walton's shrinking role and wanted new challenges and more time with her real family. Ellen Corby's serious stroke changed her ability to work, while Will Geer's death permanently changed the emotional heart of the series. At the same time, the younger cast members were growing up and choosing lives beyond the show. What looked like a single family slowly breaking apart was actually a series of personal choices, health problems, deaths, career changes, and the unavoidable passage of time. The story ends by reframing the supposed scandal. There was no single confirmed secret feud that destroyed the cast. The painful truth was more human. The actors had their own lives, and eventually real life became more important than remaining on Walton's mountain. For years, the Waltons looked like one of the safest families on television. They lived on a mountain. They worked hard. They argued, forgave each other, and gathered around the dinner table. Every episode seemed to promise the same thing. No matter how bad life became, family would hold them together. But behind that warm picture, the cast was dealing with something very different. Some actors were exhausted. Some wanted out. One major star felt her character had become boring. Another left because he feared being trapped forever as John Boy Walton. And as the years passed, death, illness, age, and changing careers slowly pulled the original family apart. The strangest part is that there was no single explosion that destroyed the Waltons. It was a slow breakup, and the reasons behind those exits reveal how difficult it could be to grow up, grow older, and stay famous on a television show that millions of people thought would last forever. This is the real story of why several major actors left the Waltons. And by the end, one thing becomes clear. The show's biggest problem was not that the cast hated each other. It was that real life kept moving. In 1972, CBS introduced viewers to The Waltons, a family drama based on the childhood world of writer Earl Hamner Jr. The show was set during the Great Depression and followed the Walton family in rural Virginia. At the center were John Walton Sr., played by Ralph Waite, and Olivia Walton, played by Michael Learned. Their children included John Boy, played by Richard Thomas, along with Mary Ellen, Jason, Ben, Aaron, Jim Bob, and Elizabeth. The family quickly became one of television's most beloved households. But the actors were not actually living in the Depression. They were working long hours on a demanding television series. The young actors were growing up in front of millions of viewers. Richard Thomas was no longer simply a child actor. He was becoming a young man while playing a character whose identity was closely tied to writing, family, and the mountain. Thomas became the emotional center of the show. John Boy was the storyteller. He watched his family. He wrote about them. And because Richard Thomas was so closely identified with the character, success created a problem. How do you become someone else when America already thinks it knows who you are? Thomas eventually decided he needed to find out. After 5 seasons and 122 episodes, he left the Waltons in 1977. The decision shocked viewers. The show replaced him with Robert Whiteman, who played a different version of John Boy. The character remained, but something felt different. For many fans, John Boy and Richard Thomas had become inseparable. Thomas later faced the long shadow of the role. He has spoken about the years it took to move beyond typecasting and build a career outside the identity of John Boy. But leaving did not mean Thomas hated the Waltons. Quite the opposite. He continued acting on stage and screen, directed episodes of the show while he was still there, and eventually returned as John Boy for later television movies. His exit was less about scandal than about freedom. He had become famous enough to be trapped by his own success. And that was only the beginning. The story behind Michael Learned was different. She entered the series as Olivia Walton and quickly became one of its emotional anchors. But even before she became famous, Learned had spent years building herself as a stage actress. The role on The Waltons was a major break, and it gave her a level of fame she had never experienced before. There was another unusual detail. For the first several seasons, she was billed as Miss Michael Learned. Producers were worried viewers might assume Michael was a man. It became a small piece of television history. Then came the awards. Learned earned 6 Emmy nominations for playing Olivia and won 3 times. That success could have made leaving seem almost impossible. But success does not always make a job satisfying. The longer the Waltons continued, the more Learned felt the role was losing its depth. Olivia had once been at the center of family stories. But as the children became older and the cast changed, there were fewer meaningful places to take her. For Learned, this was not a small complaint. An actor can tolerate long hours. An actor can tolerate fame. But if the character stops growing, the work can begin to feel empty. That was the problem she eventually faced. She stayed for years, but she began thinking about what came next. And what came next would take her away from Walton's Mountain. There was also an important detail many viewers never saw. The series had already been shaped by changes before audiences even knew the Walton family. The original television movie, The Homecoming, A Christmas Story, used different actors for several key roles. When CBS turned the story into a series, Ralph Waite and Michael Learned became the parents, while Richard Thomas carried John Boy into the new show. That meant change was built into the Waltons from the beginning. The cast people came to love was not guaranteed to remain the cast forever. And once the series became a hit, every actor faced the same strange bargain. The show could give them money, fame, and a steady career. But it could also make the character more famous than the person. For Richard Thomas, that bargain became impossible to ignore. The public often assumes that when a famous actor leaves a successful show, something terrible must have happened. Maybe there was a fight. Maybe someone was fired. Maybe the cast could not stand each other. But The Waltons does not fit that easy story. In fact, one of the most important things about the show is how close many of its actors became. The young performers spent their childhoods together. The older actors became mentors. Ralph Waite and Michael Learned developed a strong on-screen partnership as John and Olivia. Richard Thomas and Waite even took turns directing episodes. The set could feel like a second home. That made the departures harder. When Richard Thomas left, the family lost its storyteller. When Will Geer died, it lost Grandpa. When Ellen Corby suffered a stroke, Grandma could no longer work in the same way. And when Michael Learned finally walked away, the show lost Olivia. Each loss changed the emotional balance. Will Geer's story was especially painful because his exit was not a career decision. He died in 1978, shortly after completing the 6th season. Geer had brought warmth and humor to Grandpa Walton. His presence helped create the feeling that the Walton children were surrounded by several generations of family. His death meant the show had to write around a loss that viewers could feel. The real-world grief became part of the television story. Ellen Corby's situation was different. In 1976, she suffered a major stroke. She eventually returned to the series, but her appearances became more limited. For a show built around a large family sitting together, seeing Grandma appear less often was impossible to ignore. It also reminded viewers that the people they watched every week were aging. That may sound obvious now, but in the 1970s, television stars could feel almost permanent. Audiences did not just watch them. They invited them into their homes. They expected the same faces to appear every week. The Waltons made that expectation especially powerful because its whole message was about family stability. But real life was breaking that illusion. Then there was Ralph Waite. Waite played John Walton Sr., the father who seemed to hold the family together through hard times. His relationship with Michael Learned became one of the strongest parts of the show. Years later, Learned described their bond as unusually close and said they cared deeply for one another, even though they did not act on any romantic feelings. Their chemistry helped make John and Olivia believable. But the show also took a toll on the actors behind those characters. Waite had his own struggles and later continued working after the Waltons, taking roles in films and television. He also became involved in politics and made an unsuccessful run for Congress in 1990. His life after the show was a reminder that the actors were not simply frozen as the Walton parents. They had other dreams, other problems, other chapters. Michael Learned eventually reached her own breaking point. She later explained that the show had become less satisfying and that she wanted to spend more time with her real children. There was also a practical problem. The series demanded a huge commitment. Television production could consume most of the year. For an actor with a family outside the show, that meant missing ordinary life while playing a mother on screen. Learned had already given years to Olivia. Now she wanted something different. She left after the 8th season. The show continued into its final season without her as a regular. For fans, it was another painful reminder. The family could survive, but it was no longer the same family. And then came the most uncomfortable part of all. The younger cast members were reaching adulthood. Mary Ellen, Jason, Ben, Aaron, Jim Bob, and Elizabeth were no longer little children. The actors who played them had spent years being treated like television children. Now they had to decide what kind of adults they wanted to become. That transition was not always simple. Some continued acting. John Walmsley, who played Jason, developed a career in music and later worked in the entertainment business. Judy Norton, who played Mary Ellen, continued acting and moved into theater and other creative work. Eric Scott, who played Ben, eventually moved into business. Mary McDonough continued acting and writing. David W. Harper largely stepped away from the spotlight. Cami Codler, who played Elizabeth, eventually pursued education and teaching. The important point is that leaving Hollywood did not necessarily mean failure. For some of the younger cast, leaving acting was simply another form of growing up. They had spent their childhoods pretending to be Waltons. Now they had to discover who they were without the show. That is a very different kind of goodbye. By the late 1970s, the Waltons had become a strange combination of success and loss. The ratings could still matter. The audience was still loyal. But the original chemistry was becoming harder to recreate. Richard Thomas had left. Will Geer had died. Ellen Corby's health had changed her role. Michael Learned was preparing to leave. And the children were becoming adults. The show responded the only way television could. Kept going. That decision made business sense. Millions of people still wanted to watch. But emotionally, it created a problem. Every replacement reminded viewers of the person who had been there before. John Boy was still part of the story, but Richard Thomas was gone. Robert Whiteman took over the role, and the character continued. But fans noticed. That is one of the hardest lessons in television. A character can be written on a page, but an audience can attach itself to the actor. Once that happens, replacing the actor becomes almost impossible. Richard Thomas understood that pressure better than most. John Boy had made him famous, but John Boy could also become a cage. Thomas had started acting as a child and already knew what it meant to live under public attention. The longer he played John Boy, the more difficult it became to convince audiences that he could be anyone else. So leaving was a risk. He could have stayed with a hit series and continued earning a steady paycheck. Instead, he chose uncertainty. That choice cost him something. For years, he had to fight the idea that he was only John Boy. But it also opened doors. He worked in theater. He appeared in movies and television. He took roles that had nothing to do with the wholesome young writer from Walton's Mountain. Decades later, he would become known to new audiences for completely different work. In other words, leaving the Waltons did not end his career. It helped make the rest of it possible. Michael Learned faced a similar choice, but from a different position. She was not trying to escape a child star image. She was trying to escape a character that no longer challenged her. And that is where her story becomes especially revealing. A television actor can become successful and still feel professionally stuck. The audience may think, "Why would you ever leave?" The actor may think, "What if I stay too long?" Learned took the risk. After leaving the Waltons, she starred in Nurse. The series did not last long, but Learned won another Emmy for her performance. That mattered. Proved that Olivia Walton was not the end of her career. She could build another identity. She could play other women. She could enter another world. But there was also a cost. When an actor walks away from a beloved show, Viewers sometimes feel betrayed. They do not think about contracts, schedules, creative boredom, family responsibilities, or the need to grow. They think about the character they miss. That is why cast departures can become emotional for both sides. The actor wants freedom. The audience wants familiarity. Those desires cannot always exist together. The same tension affected the younger actors. They had spent years being recognized in public. People knew their television names. They had grown up while millions watched. That sounds glamorous, but it can also be limiting. Imagine going to school while strangers know exactly which character you play. Imagine becoming an adult while the public still remembers you as a child. Imagine trying to choose a career while everyone keeps asking about the family you left behind years ago. That was the strange burden of the Waltons cast. They had not simply worked on a hit show. They had grown up inside a national memory. And then there were the deaths. Will Gere died in 1978. Ellen Corby lived for years after her stroke but could never fully return to the role in the same way. Later, Ralph Waite died in 2014. Corby died in 1999. Gere, Corby, Waite, and the rest of the cast eventually became part of television history. But when fans look back at old episodes, the faces are still alive on the screen. That is the strange power of television. It freezes people. The actors age. The audience ages. The world changes. But the episode stays the same. This is why the title, The Real Reason the Actors Left, can be misleading. There was no secret meeting where everyone decided the family was over. There was no single disgusting betrayal. There was no confirmed master scandal. There was something more ordinary and, in a way, more heartbreaking. People reached their limits. One wanted new roles. Another wanted more time with family. One actor faced serious illness.